was on my arm. The CEO's wife was smiling like she'd just solved a problem. 300 people were watching, and I was about to say the 7 words that would cost them $3.2 billion. But let me back up. My name's Jim Crawford. I'm 49 years old, and I've been doing this job for 25 years. What job? I make sure billion-dollar deals don't blow up in everyone's face. Tonight, one was about to do exactly that. See, I grew up in Pittsburgh. My dad worked the steel mills for 32 years until they shut down in '86. My mom managed a bank branch. Neither one of them had fancy degrees, but they taught me something important. Respect is earned, not given. And when someone tries to take that respect away from you in public, well, that's when things get interesting. The Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom in Chicago cost them $420,000 to rent for one night. I know because I'd seen the invoice 3 weeks earlier. That's my job. I read the fine print, check the numbers, make sure everything adds up before my company writes the big checks. Tonight's check was going to be for $3.2 billion, biggest deal in Apex Technologies history. Biggest deal my company, Stonegate Capital, had ever done too. The room looked like something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers hanging everywhere, tables covered in white linen that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Live orchestra in the corner playing the kind of music rich people think makes them look classy. 300 guests packed the place. Investors, analysts, financial reporters, all the usual suspects when someone's about to announce they're throwing around billions of dollars. Everyone dressed to the nines, everyone trying to look like they belonged. I had a reserved seat at table 2, the VIP section, right in the center of this elevated platform where all the important people were supposed to sit. My name card was right there when I sat down. J. Crawford, Stonegate Capital Partners. Clear as day. I'd been sitting there maybe 7 minutes, checking my notes on my phone, when this woman sits down next to me, late 40s, wearing a burgundy dress that probably cost more than my car, jewelry that sparkled from across the room. Diana Pemberton, wife of Howard Pemberton, the guy who started Apex Technologies in his garage 13 years ago. She wasn't on the board, wasn't an officer, but she owned a chunk of the company and had personally put together the guest list for tonight. She looked at me like I was a stain on her tablecloth. "Excuse me," she said with that fake polite voice people use when they're about to be anything but polite. "I think there's been some kind of mistake with the seating." "Don't think so," I said. "Jim Crawford. Stonegate Capital, got my reservation right here." Her eyes did that thing, you know the look. The quick up and down scan where someone's trying to figure out if you're worth their time. I was wearing a good suit, but nothing flashy, no gold watch, no designer tie clip. Nothing screaming I'm important. Big mistake on her part. "This table," she said, and now the fake politeness was getting colder, is reserved for principal stakeholders, people with ownership positions in tonight's transaction. She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "I'm sure your company has seats on the main floor. I'll have someone show you where you belong." "I'm exactly where I belong," I said. That's when she turned and waved over one of the security guys. Eddie Vargas, big guy, looked like he'd been in the Marines, moved like someone who solved problems with his hands for a living. He walked over and put his hand on the back of my chair, not on me yet, but close enough to make his point. "Sir," he said quietly, "if you could come with me. Here's the thing. When you've been in the Navy for 6 years, when you've worked your way up from nothing in the financial world, you learn to read a room. And right now, about 40 people were staring at our table. 3 phones had come up, people recording whatever was about to happen. The cameras mounted on the ceiling kept rolling too. This whole event was being live streamed to investors. Everything was being documented. I didn't move. Just put my phone down on the table, calm as you please, and looked up at Eddie. "I'll stay right here," I said. His hand moved from my chair to my arm. Firm grip. The kind of grip that says we can do this easy or we can do this hard. Diana stood up, arms crossed, looking satisfied, like she just handled some minor inconvenience. The whole room was watching now, not trying to hide it anymore. When something gets tense at an event like this, people notice, especially when phones start coming out. I looked right at Diana Pemberton. Kept my voice normal, conversational, not loud, not quiet, just loud enough for everyone to hear exactly what I was about to say. "Mrs. Pemberton," I said, "I think you better think real careful about what happens next." "I have thought about it," she said. "No." I said, "You really haven't. Because if you had, you'd know that the seat you're trying to kick me out of just cost your husband's company $3.20 billion. Nobody laughed. Nobody made a sound. The phones that were halfway up went all the way up. Diana blinked like someone had just slapped her. Eddie's grip on my arm stayed put, but something changed, like a machine that suddenly wasn't sure what it was supposed to do next. Behind Diana, I could see 2 people rushing toward us like their hair was on fire. Martin Webb, Apex's head of investor relations, and Lisa Grant, their general counsel. Both of them had that look people get when they're watching a train wreck happen in slow motion. The room went dead quiet except for the orchestra, which kept playing like nothing was happening. But here's what you need to understand about rooms full of financial people. They can smell trouble from a mile away. When the numbers don't add up, they know it instantly. And brother, the numbers had just stopped adding up. Now let me explain who I really am and why that $3.2 billion was about to disappear faster than free drinks at an open bar. After high school, I spent 6 years in the Navy, engineering division on a destroyer. You learn things on a ship about systems, how when one piece fails, everything else starts falling apart real fast. The quiet guy checking gauges down in the engine room, he might be the most important person on that whole ship. When I got out, I used the GI Bill to study business at Penn State, worked treasury operations for a few years, then moved into private capital in New York. That's where I found my calling, transaction compliance. Sounds boring, right? It's not. See, Stonegate Capital manages $18 billion. When we write checks for $1 billion or more, we don't just hand over the money and hope for the best. Every major deal goes through what we call independent authorization. Someone outside the deal team has to sign off on it. Someone whose job isn't to close the deal, but to make sure the deal should actually close. For anything over $750 million, that someone is me. I'm not the guy you see on CNBC talking about market trends. I don't get invited to speak at conferences, but I've been in the room for 23 major transactions over the past 12 years. Every single one of those deals happened because I said it could happen. And every deal that didn't happen, well, those are the interesting stories. The Apex deal had been in the works for 14 months. Howard Pemberton built a solid company, cloud architecture, enterprise security, data center management, real products, real customers, real revenue. The kind of tech company that actually deserves the money being thrown at it. The problem wasn't the business. The problem was what my Navy buddies would call command structure. How decisions got made, how people behaved when they thought nobody important was watching. Our investment agreement had something called Section 12 minus the conduct and representation integrity provision. Fancy words for if you act like an idiot in public and it makes us look bad, we can walk away. We added that clause after getting burned in 2018. CEO of a portfolio company got up at a conference and basically lied about their regulatory status. Cost us $470 million and 18,000 months in court to clean up the mess. Section 12 was designed to prevent that from ever happening again. The language was crystal clear. Any conduct by an officer, director, or major shareholder that materially compromises the reputational integrity of the transaction may trigger the fund's right to withdraw the capital commitment in full. No intent required, just documentation. And tonight's gala, the one Diana Pemberton had personally organized, the one being live streamed to our investors, the one being recorded by every camera in this hotel, that was documentation. Martin Webb reached our table about 50 seconds after Eddie grabbed my arm. He was breathing hard, which for Martin was like seeing a mountain start to sweat. Guy had been handling investor relations for 7 years and never lost his cool. His eyes went from Eddie to Diana to me, and I could practically see him calculating how bad this was about to get. Lisa Grant arrived right behind him. She took one look at the phones recording everything, and I saw her face go pale. Corporate lawyers live in fear of exactly this kind of moment, Mrs. Pemberton, Martin said, voice carefully controlled. Could I have a word with you? We're just handling a seating mix-up, Diana said, but her voice had changed. She was starting to realize the temperature in the room had shifted. This is Jim Crawford, Martin said, still keeping his voice level. He's Stonegate Capital's authorized compliance representative for tonight's transaction. Diana looked at me again. I could see the gears turning, but slowly. When you've already committed to a course of action in public, it's hard to back down gracefully. Lisa Grant stepped forward. Mr. Crawford, I apologize for any confusion. Appreciate that, I said, but we need to talk privately. The executive suite on the hotel's 42nd floor had a conference table for 14 people. 35 minutes later, 5 people sat across from me. Martin, Lisa, Howard Pemberton himself, Paul Westfield, the CFO, and Diana. Howard looked like a man watching his life's work balance on the edge of a cliff. He was 53, built like someone who'd actually worked with his hands before becoming a CEO. I'd reviewed his technical background. The guy knew his stuff inside and out. Jim, he said, putting his hands flat on the table, I'm going to be straight with you. What happened downstairs was wrong. I won't call it a misunderstanding because it wasn't. My wife made an assumption, security acted on it, and it happened on camera. I respected the directness. It was the right play. Here's what we need to discuss, I said, opening my folder to the marked page. Section 12 of our investment agreement. Your legal team reviewed this clause, approved the language. Let's walk through it together. Lisa already had her copy out. Paul found his page. Howard leaned over to read from Lisa's document. I read the relevant section out loud. Nobody interrupted. When I finished, Paul looked up. The clause mentions reasonable determination of the fund's authorized compliance representative, he said carefully. What's your determination? Good question. Professional, no nonsense, no attempt to sugarcoat what we all knew was happening. Tonight's event was live streamed to our investors, I said. The full event was recorded. The footage exists of an Apex major shareholder instructing security to physically remove Stonegate's compliance representative from the VIP section, in front of cameras during a transaction announcement. The room stayed silent. Plus, the seating assignment was confirmed by your event coordinator. This wasn't a mistake. This was a judgment call about who belonged where. Howard closed his eyes for a second. You could see him connecting the dots, realizing there was no way to unconnect them. What would it take for Stonegate to consider this resolved? Martin asked. Smart question, but I couldn't answer it alone. That's above my pay grade, I said. You need to talk to my boss tonight, Howard asked. Already called him. He's standing by. The conference call happened at 11:50 p.m. Paul Stevenson, Stonegate's managing partner, had been at some fancy dinner in New York when I reached him 3 hours earlier. I'd given him the full rundown, the seating incident, the security involvement, the cameras rolling. Paul listened without interrupting, asked a few questions about the documentation, then said what I knew he'd say. You know what this means, Jim? Yeah, I knew. On the call, Paul was all business. Professional, measured, no emotion. He acknowledged that Apex had reached out directly about the evening's events. He noted that video evidence existed and that our legal team would review it against Section 12. Then came the question everyone was waiting for. Is the transaction suspended or terminated? Howard asked. The pause before Paul answered felt like it lasted 5 minutes. In reality, it was maybe 3 seconds. We'll communicate our formal position in writing by 9 a.m., Paul said. I'd recommend your team prepare for either outcome. Click. Call ended. Howard stared at the center of the table like he was trying to solve a math problem that had no good answers. I could see him running calculations in his head. How many people he'd need to call, how fast word would spread. What this would do to their other financing options. Anything else you need from me tonight? I asked. Lisa shook her head. We have what we need for our review. I stood up, closed my folder, straightened my jacket. Before I left, I looked at Howard one more time. For what it's worth, I said, you built something real here. Good product, solid team, legitimate business. I've put all that in my reports. He looked up at me. But here's the thing about billion-dollar deals. They're not just about moving money from point A to point B. They're about trust, about how people behave when they think the stakes are low. I picked up my phone. What happened downstairs wasn't low stakes. It was the whole ball game. I walked out of that conference room at 12:15 a.m. The email hit my phone at 8:52 the next morning. I was back in my hotel room, drinking coffee, and going through files for my next transaction when it came through. Stonegate Capital Partners hereby withdraws its capital commitment to Apex Technologies in full effective immediately, pursuant to Section 12 of the executed investment agreement dated February 8, 2025. That was it. $3.22 billion gone, not postponed, not under review, not subject to renegotiation. Gone. My phone rang before I finished reading the email twice. Howard Pemberton's name on the screen. I thought about it for a second, then answered. Jim, he said. His voice sounded like he'd been up all night, which he probably had. Can I ask you something? Shoot. Was there any way this ended differently? After last night, was there a path that didn't lead here? I respected the question. It was the right thing to ask, not trying to blame anyone, just trying to understand if there had been an off-ramp he'd missed. If someone had stepped in before Eddie put his hand on my arm, I said maybe. If the video showed your people de-escalating instead of escalating, Section 12 might have looked different. The clause doesn't require perfection. It requires institutional response. Long pause. Nobody stepped in, he said. Nobody stepped in. I agreed. Another pause, even longer. I'm sorry, Jim. I want you to know that. I know you are, I said, and I'm sorry it went this way. I meant what I said about the company. After I hung up, I sat there for a few minutes thinking about my old man. He used to say something when one of us kids was about to make a decision without thinking it through. You're starting a sentence you don't know how to finish? Diana Pemberton had started a sentence that morning when she looked at me and decided I didn't belong. By the time she figured out how that sentence was going to end, it was way too late. The financial news picked up the story by noon. Not the details, those stayed private, but the basics. Major shareholder incident at investor event. Cameras rolling, fund pulls out same day, $3.2 billion deal dead. By the end of the week, Apex's valuation had dropped 40%. Other investors who'd been circling started backing away. Word travels fast in this business, and the word was that Apex had problems with governance and institutional behavior. 3 months later, Howard restructured the entire company. New board of directors, new policies, new oversight. Diana stepped back from any company-related activities. He brought in an outside consulting firm to review their decision-making processes from top to bottom. Smart moves. The kind of moves that showed he understood what had really gone wrong. I sent a message through a mutual contact. Governance changes show serious institutional commitment. Market watches behavior, not promises, not an invitation, not a guarantee. Just a fact about how this business works. Money follows demonstrated patterns of behavior over time. Not good intentions, not apologies, not promises to do better. Actual documented behavior. I've been in rooms where billions changed hands, and I've been in rooms where billions walked away. The difference usually comes down to something simpler than any financial model can capture. It's whether the people across the table act the same way when they think nobody important is watching as they do when they know everyone is. Diana Pemberton looked at a guy in a decent suit sitting at a table and made a split-second judgment about whether he mattered. She made that call based on appearances, assumptions, her personal hierarchy of who deserved respect. She didn't see the folder. She didn't see the clause. She didn't see the cameras or the live stream or the 14 months of deal work sitting in a signed contract. She saw someone she figured she could remove. So she tried to remove him. My father was right about finishing sentences. By the time Diana figured out how her sentence was going to end, the deal was already over. 6 months after Chicago, I got a call from an old Navy buddy. Tony Ricci, guy I served with on the destroyer. He'd gone into construction after getting out, built a decent business in Jersey. Jim, he says, you gotta help me out here. I'm bidding on this big municipal contract, and there's this woman on the selection committee. She keeps looking at me like I crawled out of a sewer. What she's saying, it's not what she's saying, it's how she's saying it. Like I don't belong in the same room as her. Like my 20 years building schools and hospitals don't count because I don't talk fancy enough. I knew exactly what he meant. Here's what you do, I told him. Document everything. Every meeting, every interaction, every piece of paperwork. Make sure you follow every procedure to the letter. And when she tries to push you around, stay calm and professional. Why? Because eventually people like that overplay their hand. And when they do, you want to make sure you're ready. Tony got the contract 3 weeks later. Turned out the selection committee chairwoman had been steering contracts to her brother-in-law's company for 2 years. When that came to light, Tony's meticulous documentation made him look like the only honest bidder in the whole process. That's the thing about this business, about any business really. People think power comes from being the loudest voice in the room, from having the fanciest title, from knowing the right people at the right cocktail parties. But real power comes from being prepared, from understanding the systems. From knowing that when someone tries to push you around, the best revenge isn't getting emotional, it's being right. I learned that lesson in the Navy, watching guys twice my size defer to a chief petty officer who barely came up to their shoulders. Rank mattered, but knowledge mattered more. The guy who knew how to read the gauges, how to spot trouble before it became a crisis, how to follow procedures that kept everyone alive, that guy had the real power. Same thing applies in corporate America. The flashy executives with the corner offices, they come and go. The quiet professionals who understand how things actually work. We stick around. Diana Pemberton made the classic mistake of confusing performance with substance. She saw the stage, the lights, the expensive venue, and figured that made her the director of the show. What she didn't realize was that the real show was happening in the fine print of a contract she'd never bothered to read. I think about that night sometimes, about those few seconds when everything hung in the balance. Not the moment when I said the deal was dead, that was just the inevitable conclusion. I think about the moment when Eddie's hand first touched my arm. That was the moment when Diana could have stepped in, could have said, wait, let me double check this. Could have asked Martin or Lisa what was going on before letting it escalate. Instead, she doubled down, committed to her assumption, and let pride drive the decision. I've seen it happen dozens of times over the years. Smart people, successful people, people who've built real businesses and made real money, throwing it all away because they couldn't admit they might have misread a situation. The aftermath at Apex was messy but predictable. Stock price tanked. Board brought in outside consultants. Howard had to spend 6 months rebuilding relationships with investors who suddenly questioned whether his company could handle big league deals. Deanna filed for divorce 8 months later. Not my business, but word gets around in these circles. Apparently she blamed Howard for not protecting her from the Chicago incident. Like it was his fault she'd decided to pick a fight with the wrong person. Some people never learn. Howard, to his credit, did learn. He restructured everything. Governance, decision-making processes, investor relations protocols. brought in independent board members with real experience, created clear chains of authority for public events. Most importantly, he made sure everyone in the company understood that respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn through competence and professionalism. 18 months after Chicago, Apex closed a $2x1 billion deal with a different fund, smaller than what Stonegate had offered, but they got it done. Clean process, no drama, no incidents. I wasn't the compliance officer on that deal, but I heard it went smooth as silk. Howard had learned his lesson about institutional behavior. Last month, I was in Detroit for another transaction. Stopped by the old neighborhood where I grew up, drove past the house where my parents raised 3 boys on a steelworker's salary and a bank manager's discipline. The neighborhood's changed some, but the values are the same. Work hard, respect the people around you, and don't let anyone push you around just because they think they can. My father would have understood what happened in Chicago perfectly. He spent 32 years watching management types come and go at the plant, guys in suits who thought they knew better than the people actually doing the work. He also watched a lot of those same guys get humbled when reality caught up with their assumptions. The mill doesn't care about your college degree, he used to say. It cares about whether you know what you're doing. Same principle applies everywhere. The market doesn't care about your designer dress or your husband's title or how much you spent on the venue. It cares about whether you know what you're doing and whether you treat people with the respect they've earned. Diana Pemberton learned that lesson the expensive way. $3.2 billion expensive. But here's the thing. I don't tell this story to gloat about what happened to her. I tell it because it illustrates something important about how power really works. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition or insist on special treatment. It sits quietly with a folder, does its job professionally, and waits to see how people behave when they think nobody important is watching. Because in the end, that's the only test that matters. Look, if you've ever been the guy in the room who everyone underestimated right up until the moment they couldn't afford to anymore, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The quiet professionals who keep the lights on while the executives take credit. The people who actually read the contracts while everyone else is focused on the champagne and handshakes. We're not the ones making speeches or getting our pictures in the business magazines, but we're the ones who decide whether the deal actually happens. And when someone mistakes quiet competence for weakness, when they confuse professional courtesy for pushover behavior, that's when they find out what real power looks like. Stay professional, know your worth, document everything, and remember, respect isn't given, it's earned. But once you've earned it, don't let anybody take it away from you.